Zoop. Oh no, the phone lines are down.
Zoop. There's an old photograph of this man in your parents' bedroom. Zoop.
Zoop. Don't go to that house. No one's been there for years.
Zoop. I know there's a lot of scary stuff going on, but I still am deeply engaged with what's going to happen between me and my significant other. Zoop.
Brad, stop playing around. You've been scaring me all day. Come out from behind that tree.
Zoop. Peter. Peter has been dead for 20 years. Zoop.
It's the end. And wait. An arm strikes up from the grave.
Oh. Yes. Hello. And welcome to another episode of Muprov Musings. I'm one of your hosts, Hal Munger. This is episode number 56. And joining me on the line is your classic host, Julian Bernardo.
I know we did new Julian and people really didn't like that, so we had to just go back to classic Julian, but I'm glad that you guys like me enough to demand the return. I am extremely happy to be talking about stuff. Probably I'll be saying that this whole season, but we did some kind of homework between this time and last time, right? And yeah, maybe you didn't like the homework to a certain degree.
Yeah, I watched my first horror movie. I'd never seen a horror movie before. And Julian picked out the least scary slasher for me. And it was scary.
Yeah, so Hal watched Nightmare on Elm Street. I think in the interim, I watched Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So all of these kind of form very classical slashers.
I didn't like it at all. I love in an improv setting. I think it's so fun to like pretend to kill people as realistically as possible. I don't like the blood. I don't like seeing people's actually getting, and I really hate the music. I know it's a vital part of, but I think if I just listened to that soundtrack for an hour and a half, I would start to get very anxious and have an upset stomach. So even that was a little too much for me.
But we did this labor for you all because you might note that today is going to be a deep dive into the genre of a slasher. And we'll talk a lot about, I think, how to adapt some of these things to improv and what parts we do and don't want to adapt. But yeah, as with any genre that you improvise, there's just a lot of tropes and things that typically happen in the genre that we are going to try to give a bit of a breakdown, talk through based on our understanding of it culturally and also the little homeworks that we did.
Yeah. So before we get into sort of what the key points are to understand, I feel like there's an open question about what the right way is to approach genre and tropes. Really is your aim to try to emulate as closely as possible or to sort of experiment and unsettle and do things that have never been done before? And I think it kind of depends on what your aim is in general. So like if your aim is parody, and you're like, I'm trying to make a parody of a slasher movie in a goofy way, how would you go about that, Julian? What would you?
I think, if it's a parody, you can pretty strictly adhere to every trope. And obviously some tropes will be things that you don't like, but you can, I think people often present them in a tongue-in-cheek way where it's kind of obvious to the audience that the author of the improv show is not in favor of some of these tropes or just thinks they're kind of goofy or outdated in certain ways. You can lean into the absurdity of it. But if you're doing a parody, I think that there may be less reason to remove tropes.
Mm-hmm. And some slashers, my understanding is that they are already almost in the genre of slasher parody. Like that, there's a whole spin-off genre of trying to be as gory as, like still, it is still a slasher movie, but it's like the point is that people watch it and kind of laugh. Right?
Yeah, totally. We're going to talk some about the history of slashers, but there's definitely an era where this comes out big and it's extending into the modern era. Like all slashers that you watch are kind of keenly aware of the fact that you probably know some of the base slasher tropes, and so they'll play with those in ways that are similar to
Mhm.
like a parody.
And then the flip side of that is that I think if you're trying to genuinely create like something horrific and new, I think it's very exciting to not have as much of a rigid structure or to intentionally play with it. Because I think always when you start to, and we're not even going to talk about structure that much in this episode, but anytime that there are these tropes, I think that the unsettling of them and the starting with something familiar and then twisting it is where the memorable part of your show comes in. So if you get the end of the show and it went exactly according to plan, like maybe you weren't taking enough risks.
Yeah, I mean, even in the slasher genre, like as the years go on, you see ways that they keep trying to change base facts about the genre to keep relevant. And like Scream, for example, which is one of the most popular slasher movies, in a lot of ways does feel a bit like a slasher parody, and like it's trying to change some of the tropes. So it's very keenly aware
Mhm.
of what slasher movies are, and it plays that in jest sometimes, and then also make some of the key revelations of the movie different than what you would expect.
Yeah. So regardless of which of those two things you're trying to do, it's pretty important to understand what's out there already in the water, and that will help you either follow it or break away from it. And it's also fun to have a mix of people in the cast. Like Julian has seen a lot of these things and knows a lot about them, and I haven't, but have improvised a lot of them. So it leads to sort of natural balance of I'm going to be naturally unsettling because I have no idea what the tropes are, and Julian's going to be keeping us on the rails. But I have I read a lot. When we were starting this, I kept on suggesting things that were slasher adjacent that I could. I was like, what about I just saw King Lear, and I was like, whoa. There's no one killer, but there is one guy who's causing most of the trouble, and people die in pretty gruesome ways. And then, like, I've read Frankenstein a bunch of times, and that is definitely like he builds the monster, and then the monster is just like killing everybody one by one. And so it it feels like this has been around for a while. And even if right now you're not thinking like, oh, horror movie is my thing, I feel like there are lots of examples that follow a similar structure that inspired this kind of work. And you could always peel it a couple layers back and be like, well, a Frankenstein thing would be fun. What if we do some sort of monster movie or some other thing where it's like
Yeah.
uh, a little more
Yeah.
literary?
One of the exercises that we often do when we're dealing with any new genre, slasher or not, is go through and just try to name things from the genre, or name examples of some trope in a genre. And invariably, whenever we would do this, someone would say, "I don't know if this is technically a slasher, but in this movie they do this similar thing," and that showcases that exactly these things are everywhere. And yeah, there might be a tendency to maybe mentally block out like, oh yeah, no, I don't know slashers, so I don't know these things. But pay attention, think about how these structures and character archetypes and stuff show up in really anything, because while this genre has a high concentration of it, these things appear everywhere.
Mm-hmm. But once we get into like what you would actually consider slashers, like what's the what's the vibe or the history, if you have any informally, Julian? I'm not super aware of how this all works.
Yeah, so I actually today and yesterday started checking out this book, which is I'll pull up the name of it by the end of the episode, but it's this guy who did his PhD thesis on breaking down the he was specifically focused in the history and the cycles of slasher movies. Uh, and so, yeah, I got a bit of a brush at it. He gives an attempt to define a slasher movie, which he acknowledges might not be wholly encompassing, but it's something to the effect of a film in which some other entity, be it human or not, progressively kills innocent people in some location until one person is left, and the slasher is defeated, although not necessarily permanently. So that's his attempt at it. I think, yeah, you probably have a bit of a basic understanding, but there is some character or entity, the slasher, who is killing people in the show, and the focus is on scaring people, showing them visceral scenes, making them feel uncomfortable and tense. I think that's the base bones of a slasher.
Hmm. Yeah, and then how did these movies evolve as well? I feel like this is just I'm kind of interested.
Yeah, so he has a bit of a diversion where he has kind of a strong opinion on maybe what the first slasher is. So a lot of people like to say that maybe Psycho, the Hitchcock film from 1960, is the first slasher. He takes a pretty strong stance that this is not the first slasher, and that while that it is an ancestor of the slasher genre, but it's also the ancestor of other genres that are different from slasher, such that it can't necessarily be considered within the slasher genre. And he notes that the first slashers, they're truly slashers, both came out in 1974, being Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Black Christmas. And then, but he notes that there's no real commercial viability of slashers until 4 years later in 1978 when Halloween comes out. And Halloween is both the most successful slasher up to that point and also the most embedded in the tropes
Mhm.
that we still know today.
Yeah, and even oh god, I hated doing this homework, but I think if you're trying to improvise it, like a huge part of learning how to do genre improv is like watching the
Yeah.
watching the source material.
It
Uh,
was funny to watch. Yesterday is when I watched Halloween. I'd never seen Halloween, but it was funny because we talk a lot about slasher tropes, having done this improvised slasher quite a few times. Uh, it is so by the books that it honestly had no effect really on me because every move it does is like, wow, this really is the blueprint for what all the later slashers were. But and it's Texas Chainsaw and Black Christmas vary in certain ways that make them feel not exactly like this genre, but there will often be some sort of canonical example within whatever genre you're looking at.
okay, so maybe Halloween is my homework before the next episode on structure. God, okay, I gotta shake it. I gotta shake it. But then I think as it went on and slasher movies became more popular is when things started to become more parody and self-referential, and you have the fifth sequel to Jason or whatever, and like it gets silly. But so like diving in a little bit, I feel like one way to approach tropes is character and understanding sort of like what archetypes are in whatever form you're doing and picking when you want to maintain those archetypes and when you want to intentionally break them because they're outdated and wouldn't be quality producing for your cast. Um,
Yeah. Uh, maybe let's flag up front. Maybe the what I see as the most potentially excisable trope of slashers that definitely exists at the beginning, and later slashers sort of comment on it in certain ways. But Halloween, for example, is extremely embedded in this idea that the slasher is punishing like young promiscuity and like sexuality, and like
mhm.
it's very common for two teens who are getting freaky to get slashed by the slasher, or a high school girl who's sort of undressing or something to get slashed by the slasher, and we'll talk more about how the structure of these movies are often kind of like morality plays, or they're trying to convey some message. And a lot of the early ones, the basic message is like, yeah, being promiscuous at a young age is bad.
Yeah, that well, now that you say that, that was very present in Nightmare on Elm Street. But that's probably not something you want to port into your slasher unless you're specifically making a parody and trying to like undo that trope. I feel like uh that's not going to be something that most of the players are going to have fun with. And just in general, slasher I think interacts with gender in a strange way. In that most of the movies in the genre, or like a huge percentage of them, have a female protagonist escaping from a male slasher, although there are some big exceptions. And I think that if you want to have equality in your group as players, it's important to be able to invert that and practice in such a way so that every member of your cast can realistically depict being scared and helpless, and every member of your cast can realistically depict being terrifying, and understanding how to do that with different physical sizes, because it is a kind of cheat code if you have someone in your cast who's just enormous and put on a hockey mask and just sort of be scary by standing there. But it's sort of a more interesting and fun acting challenge, and might involve more magical powers and less just like physical strength to have someone very small be able to kill someone very large. And there's something kind of terrifying about that as well.
And there is no dearth of, while the gender dynamics are truly there in slasher movies, like there is no dearth of like different body sizes or types being the slasher. Like there's a whole industry of like slashers where the slasher is like a wacky kind of character. There's Thanksgiving where it's like a turkey or, leprechaun, or it's like, like there's,
Well,
yeah.
There's also like isn't there like the Chucky doll, and like I think of those little
Child's
twins
Play.
from The Shining. I know they're not the killer, but lots of different. But I think it's good to have a check-in with your group before trying to go into a genre that was made a long time ago, because there's usually all this sexist garbage that you have to sort of excise in a careful way, because if you just are like, oh, let's recreate it based on vibes, like that will seep into your play. And noticing it, calling out, having a director who actively is like, pause, let's try to work through this and make a new choice that intentionally inverts some of those tropes.
Yeah, the other excisable trope from slashers that I'll just mention here, which I feel like we shouldn't have to tell you not to do this one, but like black guy dies first in the slasher movie is another one that is just a trope in the genre that I think is excisable as well.
Yeah, so again, putting away, like I think that's the first thing you want to do is go through and be like, which tropes are racist, sexist, or just like not something that you want to carry forward into your play. But then flipping back, what are some tropes some character traits that are fun, that are going to be fun for everyone in your ensemble to be able to play with?
So I think one of the big things that we see in slasher characters are strong, mildly dislikable personalities with each other. So typically, like I said, it's innocent people, at least to some degree, who are being slashed. But given that it's typically like younger people, high school or in that age, doing these things, it's very like frivolous arguments that they're having at the beginning, and people are acting annoying to one another. So having like a unstable high personality group is one trope that I think is big.
Yeah, you get a lot of people who are kind of overconfident and kind of making stupid decisions, like to split up or to go follow a sound that they heard, and that can be a very fun thing to play.
You often within this kind of like overconfident archetype, there's often overconfident character who specifically enjoys scaring the other like members in the group. We'll hide in a closet or jump out from a tree or something as like it's a great mild scare early on in the show. It keeps you on your toes, and this like happens a lot.
Yeah, that's very true. And then that person often actually gets killed, and people think it's you might think that they're faking it or something, and then suddenly, and I do think that it is kind of delightful to see an innocent protagonist, and especially one who kind of learns over the course of the show to how to stand up for themselves or become violent or X, Y, or Z to sort of outsmart the slasher by the end. So I think that getting all the people in your cast comfortable with playing someone who's like has not encountered violence before this moment and slowly learns how to actually interact with the slasher as the show goes on.
Yeah, that's definitely a good like protag trait you can have. I think the other big way to characterize the the victims in a slasher film are like naive. I think regardless of whether they are like the protagonist who lives or not, like they often start from a naive place, and this typically comes from them being kids or young or something like that. But uh, there is a sense of naivety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also selfishness. I feel like there's
Yeah.
sometimes either betrayal or like one person's in danger, and rather than going to save their friend, they abandon them, and then that comes back and haunts them. So making choices early on that can haunt you later is a very fun thing. At least in Nightmare on Elm Street, when I was watching it, like the the boyfriends in it were very lame, and they were not particularly helpful in saving the people from being killed, and then they themselves were pretty brutally killed.
Yeah. Speaking of boyfriends, I feel like there's almost always like a couple, at least one couple that
Mm-hmm.
exists in these movies. And yeah, that one's just, I mean, honestly, for any show, it's just fun to have a variety of relationships that the characters have to one another. So if you have two that have a couple, that just adds a fun dynamic to play out,
Yeah.
especially when they get split up.
But yeah, it can particularly be fun to have a couple that has some problems
Yeah,
within the
exactly.
relationship, where it's not like your standard improv couple necessarily. The And practicing specifically scenes of like, let's start and let's just endow a relationship. It could be a friendship or a romantic relationship that has issues that are consistent, and usually I feel like the movie plays at that and kind of tries to put them in situations that the issues with the relationship extend into a much bigger thing.
Yeah.
Flip side of that is also I haven't seen this in a slasher movie, but in a lot of movies I love, a big emotional beat comes from like sacrifice.
Mhm.
If you can build up a pair of characters who have an extreme bond of love and really get along well, and then uh, they're put in a situation where one of them can be like, "No, get out of here." Uh, Sacrifice is a great tool in your arsenal, also for getting the kill order right. If it's clear one character is the protagonist and they are about to die, you might just have to throw yourself in front of that knife to get them out of that scene.
As you say that, the maybe a more common trope comes to mind within slashers, which is the flip side of this that creates some despair, but a betrayal among two characters who love each other, and it's almost it's very common, I think, for the betrayal to happen, and just empirically, it's like the boyfriend may often like betray the girlfriend in the show, and then thinking that, oh, like, okay, I'm gonna get out, but then the boyfriend gets killed. It
Mm-hmm.
kind of like the moral punishment for the betrayal. But yeah, having the betrayal is a nice moment of the flip side, big emotional beat, but
Uh-huh.
induces terror maybe rather than comfort.
Yeah, and you can obviously invert any genders that you want in any places. Are there any other well, I guess also we did talk about the overconfident person, but I do think it's fun to have at least one of your characters seem physically powerful and adept in some way, and that the more you can build someone up as this is the classic like anime thing where you bring in someone strong and then have them be defeated to make the person who's slasher look really really strong. So having at least one of your characters who seems like they could take the slasher and then killing that person early is a good way to make the slasher seem powerful.
Yeah,
um
I think that's a pretty comprehensive look at
uh,
base character traits that
I,
are. Oh yeah.
I'll throw in parents as well. If you are doing a slasher with younger people, like in school time, I feel like a very classic thing is parents maybe who don't trust what's going on and are not helpful,
Yeah, that's a real one.
and police.
Uh, but yeah, these are traits that might refer to the protagonist slash the victims of the slasher. I think might be fun to get into some of the traits that the slasher themselves might have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
we're gonna do a whole episode on this on how to be the slasher. But uh, for starters, the slasher is a character that's often built up by the members of the cast who aren't the slasher, which is
mm,
interesting in an improv setting because they're not always on stage right away, and there's usually a lot of myth and legend about them. It's
yeah.
really fun to be able to endow sort of a baseline thing for that person to then kind of come in and fill.
Yeah, it's like this extended, more serious Here Comes Charlie, if you know that game, where uh there this is just like a feature of the story that happens often, but commonly towards the beginning of the show you will have some like wise older person warn about entering some territory or crossing some boundary because there's some legend about people who do that. Don't go into that swamp, nobody's come out of there in 15 years.
Mhm.
And piece by piece you might build up certain details, and I think that that's a good thing to drip feed. It tends not Halloween does this, which made it uninteresting to me, where they kind of show the whole backstory right at the beginning. I think that other films succeed a bit more in drip feeding. Maybe that there's some sort of legend, then maybe you see a picture. I think Texas Chainsaw Massacre does this the best out of the things that I watched recently. And you slowly learn more about what the backstory is. But in any case, the backstory is often like, yeah, like Hal says, a thing of legend.
Hmm. Yeah. It's actually what you're saying is reminding me just of basic like old German fairy tales and like just the whole genre of story where it's like the point of this is to teach a kid like don't suck your thumb because if you do this thumb monster will come eat your thumb or like
Yeah.
whatever it may be, which is kind of making me laugh of like that slowly evolved and kept on it kept on evolving. But I was kind of surprised, different from how we had improvised it, was that it does seem like a lot of these slashers are just kind of like faceless, grunting monster people. And what do you think about that in the improv setting?
I I still have like a. We talked briefly about the fact that it is nice juice for the show if the slasher has more of a character and maybe interacts in some way other than just grunting and walking around and stuff. I agree that that might be more fruitful for improv, but it still stands as one of my bullseyes or targets to try to emulate more closely to what we see in films, the character of like a faceless brute who is just coming closer and closer. It feels more like a force of nature. I think we did one practice run where I played the slasher and I was trying to do something of this nature where I was more of like a kind of zombie fungus creature than anything else. And I think that there is a way to do it, but it's hard and it's like a big physical ask,
Mhm.
and requires everything else to be firing on full cylinders. So in summary, I agree it's easier to improvise the other thing, but I'm very interested to see someone do
Yeah.
a improvised Michael Myers type character.
Yeah. I think that the reason for me that I don't like this as a thing to shoot for is that it's nice in improv to use what improv does well. And when
Mm-hmm.
improv, like, even if you get really good at combat, just a continuous chase scene in combat is probably not going to be the most compelling thing. And special effects and blood and like all that stuff are not improv strengths. Where improv can be really scary is this unsettling thing where you genuinely don't know what's going to happen next, and the people on stage are genuinely unsettled. And I think that where that comes from is this psychological, fearful creation that comes out of a person who's acting in an unnatural way and can speak and employ, because what you have in improv is primarily like expression and language and movement. So having all of those things be highly evident, I think, is powerful. And also, like I said earlier, evens the playing field so that any member of the ensemble can play the slasher in a way that is terrifying and effective. And it's not just relying on, physical scariness.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And overall, it's such an interesting thing that I think I'll just think about for the rest of my life of how to adapt some of these things into different forms, because you're exactly right that something needs to change in order to for something to be a good improvised slasher that coincides with what you can do in improv well. And so much of people talking about slasher movies is going to come down to stuff like cinematography, which, there's analogs in improv, but largely it's hard to make a lot of the same moves. So we have to come up with our new moves, and maybe our new move has to do with more kind of not necessarily even wordy, but more expressive slashers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's the famous Del Close thing where he got a big bowl of noodles that were like soaking in something, and they turned the lights fully out and were like, a plague of worms will descend on you, and threw them onto the audience, which is maybe an extreme thing. But I do think that having the audience up close and moving through the audience and suddenly jumping at them is something that you don't have in a normal slasher, just as long as you warn them beforehand that might be what's happening. Um, yeah. What about like locationally? I feel like this is another like classic thing of like what are the locational tropes that are helpful in this?
So like isolation is a big thing because inevitably everybody who's watching a slash movie is going to wonder like, oh, why don't they just call someone or get help? You need to be immersed in a setting where it's plausible that for at least an hour or however long the slasher takes place that people are getting killed and there's nobody coming to help.
Mm-hmm.
So this might be an abandoned house or the woods are two common locations that come to mind.
Uh, yeah, and they're kind of the opposite of like the woods is this sort of expansive and you can't run away. You just get exhausted and
Mm-hmm.
get tracked down. That's a little harder to do on stage because you can't have like extended chases. So you need
Mm-hmm.
these scenes where the person enters like already out of breath if you're in a big arena like that. And
Mm-hmm.
then I feel like the house is a simpler thing. And um, the classic thing, yeah, you get locked into different rooms.
Yeah.
It's key if you are improvising combat in a way that is sort of slower and safer to be able to have places where you can really get stuck. And the
Mm-hmm.
more stuck you are, the easier it is to slow things down and make it this kind of visceral, horrible experience rather than this kind of quick, sloppy thing. So you can do yourself a favor by endowing places that have lots of rooms and different entrances that connect them and places where someone might get trapped or stuck.
Yeah, it will. I'm sure this will come up again, but classic move in a slasher is get yourself trapped in like a corner.
Mm-hmm.
Just like any space object, it doesn't need to be there. You can start backing up and hit the wall and realize that you're stuck and try to
Mm-hmm.
create this scene.
It actually shouldn't be there. I was recently teaching a combat thing where someone used the real wall and I was like, ah, and then they banged their head on it. And I was like, no, don't ever use real walls. Um,
There's yeah, so any remote location doesn't have to be house or woods. So many of them happen in houses now that I'm thinking, but uh yeah, a mine shaft is where it might take place. Like a hospital is
mhm.
where it might take place. Any building really.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to all be the same. Like I was a Nightmare on Elm Street. I was just watching. Like almost every kill takes place in a different house or location.
Yeah.
Like there are lots of different places that the killing
Yeah.
happens. But I think the other thing is like in each place, we like doing exercises like here's the place, what might be used for the kill. Like every place that you're in, a
Mm,
big part of why you're doing good space object work and endowing a lot of physical objects in your environment and making that place feel vivid is because the more work you do there, the more weapons the slasher has to do you away.
yeah. Again, I watched it recently, so I just keep singing its praises. But Texas Chainsaw Massacre does an amazing job at this, where they're in a house, but it's a house of people who used to be I don't know what the word you would use, but the people who kill cows to harvest beef. And so their house has all of these like meat hooks and cleavers and chainsaws and stuff where that might be like a bit on the nose of okay, yeah, you can obviously kill people with that, but just the choice of putting it in some location with lots of dangerous objects makes each of the kills potentially really interesting because there's just different ways to
Yeah.
kill people.
Yeah, let's quickly just go over. This isn't even in the show notes or anything, but some of the classic things that I feel like are good equipment to have. One of them is like a ledge or a window. It's not going to be the most dramatic kill unless the person starts dangling out of it, but endowing a big window is a fun way to slowly start to amp up tension. What are some other things like that?
I think any like big sharp object that is static is a nice thing. So
Mhm.
maybe there's like an antler on the wall, or a swordfish might be goofy, but something where that thing that you might be able to be impaled with is stuck there, and so you can have a nice scene of the slasher like pushing you onto that thing where the environment is doing the kill.
Yeah, any liquid. Like obviously if it's like big enough like a bathtub or something or a barrel, but even a small thing like a bucket is enough to drown someone. And drowning is a type of improv combat that is very easy to depict very realistically. Because it doesn't involve a lot of they can be acted very realistically by someone without having, fists flying back and forth or something like that. So something that someone can
Yeah.
be forced into.
Uh, one that I was having thoughts about this yesterday, and we should talk more about it. But it's hard to do an improv, although there's certain tweaks that can be done. But so commonly in these films, are you in a place where there are boxes and closets
Mm-hmm.
that the slasher can hide in, the slasher can stuff bodies in, just things for the characters on stage to open and be surprised at what's
Mm-hmm.
inside.
Yeah. And you can try to design your set in such a way that there are places to genuinely kind of hide. And then obviously anything that you can wrap around someone's neck, like any cloth or fabric. Those
Yeah.
strike me as the big ones.
Yeah, I think those are the big ones because true to the name, the slasher most commonly has a big knife. Like that
Mm-hmm.
is the most common weapon for a slasher to have. So
Yeah.
it's not necessary for all of these things to be around, but they just add variety because if you're killing in the same way with the same knife for the whole show, it's just not that interesting.
Yeah, so with all of these like genre, I think what you start learning how to do is like, all right, let's start just doing normal scenes, these just normal improv scenes, but let's just get used to this idea where we're endowing a lot of things that would be good to kill someone with. Let's do a
Mm-hmm.
normal improv scene, but we're endowing the type of relationships that will be fruitful later if someone starts killing us. And
Yeah.
you can kind of tell, even if you watch the first scene of a slasher and there's no mention of a killer, there's no mention of a legend, it's just a scene with a relationship. Sometimes that scene is already planting all these seeds just because the scene is in genre. So getting good at sort of understanding what each of these things will do for the plot and why you want to have like, these two people who are in love or this best friend who's scaring the other friend or whatever it may be.
Yeah. Yeah. You're just the improv feels like magic when you strongly and boldly make these choices at the beginning, and later they pay off in big ways, even though you don't know that they were going to do that. But if you just make big choices for relationships and choices that are directionally in the way of a slasher for location and setting and all this stuff, it will feel like magic when you end
Mm-hmm.
up using these things.
Yeah. And most improv, there's like this, I feel like there's this with say yes comes this like be positive
Mm,
maxim. And I think that in the slasher really works in quite a different way. And that you really want to maximize on being a positive force for your stage partner and saying things that will delight them and endow them. But I think that, yeah, there's much more of this sort of negative tension, scaring going on in the early relationships.
yeah. Yeah. It's yeah, you might find it hard, especially if you've been improvising in that way to change to having your default tone be kind of tense or negative. But it really does do a lot in terms of establishing the tone.
Yeah.
I
So,
think
yeah.
oh
I was just going to say, I think for all these things, like each thing that we're kind of mentioning, you can break it up into specific scene exercises if you wanted to in your practice and be like, all right, today we're going to be working on locations. Let's just practice running a bunch of scenes that viscerally use in a kind of creepy way the objects and the locations, but don't kill anyone yet. Today we're working on relationships. Let's try to endow relationships that specifically have issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're going to have to be doing all of this at once in the show. So start layering on multiple things at once, even if you're not focusing on it. That's the best way to practice it. One thing that I think it might be nice to speak specifically about is the broad narrative arc of the slasher. So it's an optional first thing that I'm sure we'll talk more about is like a cold open / first kill. This happens pretty commonly, but as the genre gets older and older, people don't need to be like enticed with that so much. But just having the show open with someone who is not important to the plot, or probably someone who is not important to the plot, get killed by the slasher. That is a good way to give the audience some of what they want, and maybe in a bit more of a programmed or I don't want to say ham-fisted necessarily, but more deliberately set the tone, right? If somebody dies at the top of the show, then that might make it easier for the audience to understand these first few scenes as the precursor to something really bad happening.
Yeah. And then I think the next thing you want to do is set up your characters. And already by 20 to 15 minutes in the show, I feel like before anyone has even died necessarily, besides maybe this kill that Julian's talking about, you should kind of know the optimal order to kill all the characters. And if you're running slasher, it's nice to run multiple shows with the same cast, because it's not a format that evenly shares the space over one show. It's highly like two people probably are going to get a lot of the stage time. The last person to be killed in the slasher. So you can even pre-plan it with your cast of like, on this night, this person's being the slasher. On this night, this person's, and give everyone a chance to be the slasher and try to have it vary who's the protagonist. Because the support move you can do is that if you are the slasher and you kill people in a way that their dead body is somehow still kind of walking around as a character, that can be a supportive way to let people play more. If there's a haunting ghost or a zombifying fungus or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's another hard instinct change to keep in mind is just due to the nature of people dying, it is going to be a unequal screen time thing. In Halloween, those two people, Marie's friends, who show up and then like 15 minutes later die, that just might be, probably you're gonna have more of the cast involved early on, but you're just gonna have to have someone die first.
I
think the next turn in the narrative that tends to happen after people have sort of established their characters is these two things go hand in hand. But first, some sort of warning by it's funny because this often happens at both ends of like the age spectrum. So you'll sometimes get like a old, let's say, gas station attendant or something is a canonical choice, but wise person telling you, don't go into those woods. Those are dangerous woods. People always die. Or you'll have like a child who has some intuition about, like a baby who's crying about some trip, or even like an animal. Animals always know about the slasher. It's such a funny thing. Like the dog will be barking and Michael Myers is like 100 feet away. You can't hear it, but the dog always knows that the slasher is coming. So some sort of either like wise or like intuitive figure will warn the protagonists that they're going into murky territory. And then, either immediately after or soon thereafter, the protagonists choose, with this in mind, to still venture forward. And I would compare this, if you watched our Hero's Journey series, it's a very similar but flipped version of something like meeting with the mentor, then crossing the threshold. It's totally flipped, where the mentor tells you don't cross the threshold, and you do. But I guess you still
Mhm.
always cross the threshold. But there's often this specifically enunciated moment of the protagonist entering a house or making a certain turn on a road that signifies this is the point of no return.
Mhm. Yeah, the point of no return is also often the first kill, but we'll go dive deeper into the structure on the future episode as well. But the next thing is that people start one by one being eliminated, and you usually, what kind of is the defining thing about the protagonist is usually that they interact with the slasher several times successfully and escape. Whereas most of the other people who interact with the slasher get killed on the first shot. And then finally, there's this usually one big kind of final interaction, a la the ordeal, where the question is, will this protagonist survive? And then that is answered in the scene.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think we really tended to do this, but it's just definitely more than not leave some sort of ambiguous ending of maybe the slasher's body was somewhere, but now it's not there anymore, or
Mm-hmm.
you just get some sense that the slasher is still out there. I mean, this is mostly just sequel bait for movies, but to adhere to the genre, I think it's fun, and I think it leaves a little bit of a tense mystery at the end.
Yeah. Do you know how Nightmare on Elm Street ends, Julian?
No, I don't.
Uh, like she in her dream is like it's all a dream, and she like turns her back on him, and he did like disappears basically.
Uh,
Uh, and then she like wakes up and all the friends that he's killed are like out there in a sports car like being like come on let's go, and her mom's still alive in there, and she waves goodbye and she gets in the sports car, and then all of a sudden the convertible lid comes up and the windows come up and the car starts driving. They're like what, and they're like banging on the window and they're stuck, and they're all screaming, and it goes driving off down the road and it's clear it's going to crash. And then all of a sudden, the slasher's arm comes through the door and grabs the mom, who he's already killed, and sucks her in. And like one big jump scare, and then the show. So it doesn't make any sense as an ending whatsoever. But it just has one more jump scare for you before it.
Yeah. No, yeah, the jump scares, I will say, while Halloween fell flat on me for a lot of reasons, it had good jump scares. We'll talk more about how to do it in an improv setting, and it is definitely much harder. But yeah, Halloween had good jump scares. And while we're kind of waxing about these films, I'll just say I was so thrown by the end of Halloween. And if you watch Halloween 2, you kind of, it makes sense like what happens after this. But basically they kill Michael Myers. They like, they think they kill him. At least they like shoot him, and he falls out of the building, and he's, there on the ground. They have the moment of, oh yeah, we're fine, we're safe now. Or, main character still like pretty thrown off. But the detective who's been hunting him looks over and sees that he's gone, and then just kind of like nods knowingly, like, oh, I guess he'll always be out there, but then doesn't tell anybody or make it known to the rest of the people who are hunting and being afraid of Michael Myers. He's just like, no, I guess he'll always be out there. And I'm like, dude, go tell someone it's not over.
That's funny. Yeah. Okay. Well, before we wrap, I think using the examples, one thing that I was kind of interested in was the idea to which what is scary is kind of the real, and
Mhm.
the way that each of these movies tends to have a real theme that it's trying to engage with. And this is kind of
Yeah.
where the heart of your show is going to be, and whether your show is going to feel like a kind of just empty entertainment or whether there is something under the surface. I feel like, how do you work with sort of theme and metaphor, Julian?
Yeah, it's I think slasher is a great way to get into adding theme to your improv shows and working with metaphor. Often there is some sort of societal negative that the slashers are commenting on in a broad way, where the slasher represents the like force of nature or the status quo that is being interrupted. So I'll use Texas Chainsaw again as an example, where the slasher the slasher was a former cattle murder, whatever, cattle harvester, and the whole thing is that their jobs were taken by these like machines, and similarly, the people who are coming in are not from Texas, but they're coming to maybe claim their dad's old house that he owned, and so it when you take a step back and look at it, very much feels like it's the new school coming into, yeah, it's basically like a gentrification thing for one part of that theme, and the force of the slasher is like punishing those who are committing it.
And it's also, didn't you say there's something like something about meat as well and like
Yeah, and it's
cows?
it's totally about beef as well, because yeah, it's they end up with the last girl, they're like going to eat her at the dinner table, I think the most ham-fisted thing of the whole thing is they say something like, oh well, we have to eat, sorry it's you that we have to eat, but we have to eat, so it's you're just who we're eating.
I was really
uh
surprised to learn that.
yeah, it's a total Guillermo del Toro, the movie director, became a vegetarian after watching Texas Chainsaw for some time. So yeah, it's this theme that if you're watching it and you're not really thinking too hard about it, you don't even have to lock into. And like it doesn't play super heavily, but I think that this is one of the dials where improv should turn it up to some degree as compared to films who can rely more on the beauty of all of the shots. It's my read that the more we integrate this metaphor and theme, the better will be in improv.
Yeah. Nightmare on Elm Street felt like it was very much about like PTSD.
Mm.
Because each of the people is killed in their dream, and then the people outside of them it looks like someone is asleep and like having a nightmare and wrestling with like an invisible figure, and then like they get the slash, and real blood comes out and they start actually dying or whatever. But they're the way that it kind of haunts you everywhere. Like she'll be in class and then suddenly be having these fits, and everyone treats her like she is having all these nightmares and fits because she like witnessed her best friend be murdered at the beginning of the show, at the beginning of the movie. So and she's going through all this testing. They do these EEGs on her, and like, it very much feels like, most of what you see looks like someone who's having some sort of mental breakdown in response to having seen something traumatic. But then she actually is haunted by it, and there's this physical representation of this haunting old murder that has happened coming through each of the shots. So again, no one ever mentions PTSD in the movie, and that's not like that's not the actual theme of it. But definitely, what is kind of visceral and uncomfortable about it is that it's reminiscent of something from the real world. And
To
pick carefully which topics you feel equipped to address in your improv show.
definitely pick carefully, because what I'm about to say might not be the best to improvise, but uh, one branch of things, or just a couple movies that are really good to look at for this, even though they're not technically slashers, or they're probably more generally horror, but the Jordan Peele horror movies are modern movies that are yeah, really, you really get a lot of them out of them if you think about the theme and the metaphor that's playing into it. So I think most specifically, like Get Out and Nope have very clear themes that you need to watch to totally understand. But yeah, they are like maybe the driving force behind the narrative, and also play into the resolutions at the end. I think that's a great way that this can all synthesize is if the protagonist somehow like clocks and atones, or at least understands the like wrong thing that was being done early on, then they can typically overcome the slasher who is punishing the world for this ill.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what it is taking things in real life that are genuinely kind of scary, like you're the healthcare system or something, and it's like no one's gonna watch a horror movie where it's just like you're in the healthcare system and it's not taking care of you and then you die or whatever. But if there's some sort of monsterization or physicalization of this negative thing that then is doing the killing, and then it's a metaphor for this thing in the real world. I think that that's a, if you're not trying to do a strictly just goofy comedic one, a way that you can have more resonance behind what you're doing, and to practice explicitly what's something scary in the real world, how can we manifest that into a killer.
Environmental stories are common, like the slasher kind of existing as a force of nature that's lashing out at people for in some way, like messing with the natural world. One
Mm-hmm.
that's like now that I think about it, might be my favorite example of like synthesis between the metaphor and the actual mechanic of the scariness is The Invisible Man, the more modern, like maybe 2019 remake, where it's it's very much about like gaslighting and think like knowing that something is true even if nobody else sees it around you, because you know the actual villain is the slasher is the invisible man who is doing all of these things to our main character, and she's trying to explain it to people, and nobody believes her. And you know it's her ex-husband, and it's very much about like I guess abusive relationships and gaslighting. But that one is a perfect synthesis of like yeah, if this negative trait that a person had or maybe society has was turned into like a super villain, what would that look like?
Mm-hmm.
How do we
Yeah.
like dial up these actual negative things to an 11 and make them
Mm-hmm.
scary?
Black Mirror is, I feel like they're like
Oh
they
yeah.
pretty much every technological one of like, I feel like a lot of what's scary about the modern world is the technology and you could make a villain out of most of those things. Sasha just said that they were watching a horror film that was based in like the beauty industry, where you could get these like you would basically like inject this thing, and then a perfect version of yourself would like come out of your spine, but you had to keep your old body alive too, and the new body started going crazy. Like the person started staying in the new body for longer and longer, and the old body started falling apart in this creepy way. You know.
Yeah. So there's so many things to be afraid of or have some negative feeling about. So yeah, practice even just you know we'll talk more about story spine kind of stuff, but yeah, take suggestions for what some ill of the modern world is or what some negative thing about the world, and just ideate without even any necessary game form how you might turn that into a slasher. And if you practice that a few times, maybe you'll get a stronger idea of how metaphor turns into slasher.
Yeah, Shakespeare.
Shakespeare.
Yeah, I feel like all the skills from any of the formats are going to port over. But I feel like we wrapped through most of the things that I feel like are important of how to approach genre. Being, go watch a lot of shows, isolate the individual parts of location and character relationship and events, and then practice being able to play your normal improv scenes with adding that coat of paint. You can even just do a normal scene and then do it in a genre. Do a scene in genre, then do it as a normal scene, and work those muscles that way.
And one way to actively watch, I think that the main way to get acquainted with any genre is to just watch things in that genre. But one way that I think Hal and I actively watch these things rather than passively watch them, and you can choose to do this or not, but every scene that happens, think about, could you improvise that? Could you improvise that? Could you improvise that? And there's a lot that you can't if you actually think about it and you sit down and you're like, oh yeah, there's no real way that we could have actually done that scene, but some of it you can. And if you're actively thinking about it in that way, then I think that it comes in more clearly when you're actually playing.
Mm-hmm. I do that with literally every piece of media that I watch. I give it a rating on a scale. I guess I should do 1 to 30 for, I'm a 0 to 30 for a mod, but I do it from 1 to 10 of how improvisable it was. Uh,
Yeah.
and I think that I also, when I start to improvise, I try to avoid making choices that limit the field, because let's say there is something that's an 8 on that scale that would be extremely hard to improvise and involves a lot of counterintuitive choices or like huge swaths of memory or research or whatever it is to make it happen. If you decide that you want to make your show more reliable by putting some basic structure that you're hitting every time, you are just clefting away and rocketing up every show's improvisable number to 10 because it's just not improvisable. Whereas if you're willing to look at each individual show and be like, oh, cool, that breaks this in an exciting way. How can I adapt my improv form so that this show would be possible? And that the rules don't prevent me from doing it. I think that every time you do that, you're going to get more interesting results.
Yeah. Yeah. So go get scared. It's spooky season, so go get scared. Go watch some of these.
I really can't handle watching them. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to watch anymore, but when in the past when I was prepping for slashers, I just read a lot of scene by scene summaries of them.
Yeah, that's the way to do it.
I was like, I can't watch these movies. They're too scary. So you can get all the narrative lessons from doing that. And maybe you'll miss some of the tactile, physical, how do you make it scary, but you'll still get the, how do you structure a plot?
Or just listen to Muprov Musings.
Pretty good idea, Julian. And so I guess tune in next week to hear more about how you actually improvise this stuff. But in the meantime, this has been Muprov
Musings. So my sign off is that last night at 3:30 a.m. I was sleeping soundly in my bed that exists behind me in this moment, and the fire alarm went off. That's fact one, and I want you to tell me what's a more DB fact, fact one or fact two. So fact one is that it went off, and fact two is that I just did not move a muscle. I stayed in bed. Because 3:30 is just an absurd time for a fire to happen. I know that real fires aren't scheduled, but I just can't deal with leaving at 3:30. That was just a bad time.
I will push back. There's never going to be a fire drill at 3:30.
Oh yeah, no, I clocked that pretty immediately. That it must be a actual alarm, not a drill, for it to be happening at this time. But I'm also on the first floor where I've got 2 exits, window and door. I don't know.
Julian, if you were in a slasher, you would die. You would be the first person to die, and the audience wouldn't feel bad about it. You're this guy. I was watching A Nightmare on Elm Street, and I was like, the boyfriend, she's like, just don't fall asleep like before tonight. And then he goes and like puts his headphones on, gets in front of a TV, and just instantly falls asleep because shanked. And I was like, how in this context, when all your friends are dying, could you be calm and just fall asleep? But now I know he's just like you, Julian.
Yeah. Michael Myers was just such a troll slasher because he's just a guy. Like it starts off with his backstory, and he like kills his sister when he's like 8, and she's like an adult, whatever. And then he gets sent to the mental institute, and then he breaks out. But he's just like an unstoppable force of nature. Like they shoot him, they stab him a bunch of times, and he just gets up and keeps on walking. I don't think that you need to worry too hard about what the backstory, like the validity of this happening. Like you can kind of assume that it's just something powerful like that. But I just don't get why they showed his backstory of him being a normal, because it's not even a compelling, sure, maybe at this time, maybe yes, in 1978 it was like, oh, well, that's crazy, he killed his sister. But yeah, it was just like, if you're gonna make him like this, can't you just leave his backstory ambiguous? Because the rest of it is already like, oh, this is the Myers house, like we bought the Myers house, and we're selling the Myers house.
Julian Bernardo was a grad student at the University of Michigan, and he burned in a terrible fire in 2024. But now, whenever someone doesn't trust a fire drill, he appears ready to exact his revenge.
He's also, I like this comparison because he's also like sexy at the end. Like he has his mask on for the whole movie once he's an adult. But then Jamie Lee Curtis's first movie role, actually. rips off his mask, and he's sexy. And it's like, whoa, what? You've been killing and eating dogs and killing people and stuff. How are you sexy? And that was awesome.
Yeah, so I guess that's what the future students of the University of Michigan will discover before they're trapped and set on fire for their sins.
Oh, can't you see me now? Can't you see me now? Like you did back then. Can't you see me now? I remember way back when. Oh, and times they are changing. You know, things are rearranging. Can't you see me now? Can't you see me now? Everything is changing. Can't you see me now? Can't you see me now?